When we think about how we reach 98% of society, we have to think creatively about distribution and how do we target the maximum amount of customers. And Fasset Connect essentially is our B2B to C distribution arm. Our mission is really predicated on accessibility and inclusiveness. And it's not about building, this is maybe goes against a little bit sort of the Silicon Valley grain, which is build a product that a very few people really love and admire and adore and become early adopters. I think for us, what we're trying to do is really target a broader subsegment of society. And we think that when it comes to financial services that are offered using, in our case, blockchain technology, we need to expand that net and really get more people to be able to benefit. So really it's about inclusivity, affordability, accessibility, and that's really something that's near and dear to our ethos.
Hello, Umair. Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure having you here.
Hi, Monica. Thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
No, the pleasure is all mine. So this podcast is all about how can we build more purpose-driven fintechs, yourselves being one of them. So what is your take? How can we build more purpose-driven?
Yeah, it's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, Monica. Fasset at our core, we look for a lot of sort of qualities when we're hiring people and when we're talking to people. It's one of the key things that we believe in is kind of our mission, and being mission driven is absolutely imperative. Now, our mission, which is aligned to your question, what, how do we build purpose driven fintechs, is really predicated on accessibility and inclusiveness. And really it's not about building, this is maybe goes against a little bit sort of the Silicon Valley grain, which is build a product that a very few people really love and admire and adore and become early adopters. I think for us, what we're trying to do is really target a broader subsegment of society. And we think that when it comes to financial services that are offered using, in our case, blockchain technology, we need to expand that sort of net and really get more people to be able to benefit from this piece of technology. So really it's about inclusivity, affordability, accessibility, and that's really something that's near and dear to our ethos.
Yes. So then can you expand on what's your purpose? Fasset's purpose.
Sure. Yeah, it's very clear. It's very simple, really. When we think about Fasset, we want to enable a broad spectrum of society to create and preserve wealth. A lot of apps make money by enticing users to spend. Fasset really is focused on getting users to save and really grow and preserve wealth across all segments of society, not just the few that have access to tier one assets.
Yes. And I think that is such an important pain point across everyone, because I think many fintechs, let's say, they may focus on financial inclusion or accessibility. And that means certain things at the lower level of the pyramid, let's say. But when it comes to building wealth, middle class is squeezed across the world.
It means, Micah, and it's even more so in emerging markets, Asia, the global South, right? Where in our markets, really, there's only sort of two ways for people to create and preserve wealth. It's invest in real estate and gold. And both of those assets or asset classes are not accessible for probably more than 50-60% of the population.
Exactly.
So absolutely, it really is about offering a proposition to 98% of society, not the 40% that has the ability to already create wealth.
Yes. And then if we go a little bit deeper, let's say this 98% of society, even though fintechs, as we know them today, like this, and sorry, even though fintechs have been around for, let's say, 10 years, and we've had a ton of impact, I believe that the problem statement of money stress, we have not reduced that drastically. It's like we have not seen a major difference. We've seen progress and we've had a ton of impact, but the problem statement is there. And you could even argue that it's even growing in developing countries post COVID. So, what do we need to do as an industry to have 10 times more impact in the next 5 years? Then?
Yeah, so I think there's two things in our view. One is obviously cast the net wide in terms of offer a value proposition, a series of services, a suite of products to the wide array of society, the masses. So that sort of is number one, which is the obvious one, is offer a value proposition that really appeals to and is a need for, as you said, 98% of society, not the privileged 2%. So that's number one. The second thing I really believe also is we need to rethink business models in fintech a little bit as well. When it comes to, let's say, conventional fintech, especially in emerging markets, a lot of the ways that fintechs have made money is predicated on lending. And lending, there's lots of studies, even in places like the UK, where you've had APR caps and regulatory caps on lending. Lending can have a very detrimental effect on society. And so if we rethink sort of the business model, the unit economics, how do we actually, I think we can get to profitability and other, sort of business elements later on, but it does require a bit of a rethink around business models. So those are kind of the two things. One is affordability, inclusiveness, access. And the second is what are the unit economics and the business models that drive fintechs?
Is how can you expand on that? Because if we think about the financial products behind the fintechs, a loan is a loan, savings, like they're saving, like the core business model of these products, it's like a commoditized product right now. How could you challenge those unit economics?
Yeah, it's difficult. Like it's not, it's especially as I'm sure there's been a huge focus in the broader venture capital community around fintechs, the profitable, and profitability has become the North Star as opposed to revenue growth at all cost. So how do you balance that with obviously re-engineering business models? It's a difficult one, right? But I think in our case, for example, we believe that if you're offering financial assets that are unique, high yielding, and appeal to a broad spectrum of society, that there are essentially non-interest based or net interest margin types of business models. For example, transactional models. You can have markups, and those markups can be very modest. But when you apply them to 98% of the population, and that volume is when, in aggregate and in absolute basis, those start to make sense from a business model perspective. That's how we approach it. It's not a net interest margin business model. It's we obviously have an exchange type of a business model where you've got transactional activity, and then if you're offering products that aren't available, customers are actually happy to pay sort of cost plus types of prices for those products.
Yes. So if we come back to impact, then let's say that we rethink the business models. We all rethink our pricing and we build companies that have customer impact and commercial impact. And we reach that 98% of people, right? Like, how would you measure that we got there and that we had that impact?
Yeah, so some of those uh, actually the measurements are fairly objective, right? You can even look at there's lots of studies around bank accounts, for example, and how most emerging markets, the number of people that have bank accounts, I think there's a statistic out there that this sort of three-fourths of the adult population are either underbanked or don't have bank accounts, right? So just the sheer number of people that have sort of money that they're able to park away, whether those are users or customers or, sort of bank account holders, that's a very objective measure. People that are part of the overall financial system, again, whether it's tax filings or whatever, these things can be objectively measured. And so if you have a scenario where less than half the population has a bank account, by definition, they're excluded from the financial system and being able to take part in financial activities. So I think there are some broad measures that are fairly objective, but then it becomes a little bit trickier when you talk about what is the impact of, let's say, replacing interest-based business models with non-interest. Like that, I think is a little bit trickier.
Mhm.
I was to come up with a hypothesis, I would say overall society probably would be better off, but that is a bit of a subjective sort of hypothesis or construct. It isn't that easy. So there's a combination of objective and subjective metrics, and yeah, each have their own sort of measures.
Yes, definitely. And then probably to build on those metrics, the if we want to deliver impact, that is done via the fintechs as such, the companies, or more specifically via the product that we build and deliver to customers. So before we go into more detail into Facet, what is your definition of a great product?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question because it's a very fundamental question. And I think the answer really is a great product in our view is a product that can be used by uh, anybody, right? The most simplistic user interface, the most secure, clean UX. We're not trying to offer very complex derivatives, which only appeal to a subset, again, of society that are very sophisticated investors, for example, right? So I think for us, it's about how do we design products that are intuitive, that are very easy to use, and can be used by, as I said, 98% of the population and not the sophisticated 2%.
Yes. So then can you go deeper into Facet? And it's what is the actual problem statement that you're solving?
Yeah, I think I'll illustrate the problem statement with a very simple example. We have a large team of developers in Pakistan, for example. These developers have iPhones, they work on iMacs, but they don't have the ability to buy Apple shares. And if you look at which stocks over the last 20 years have generated the most alpha, certainly in the technology space, Apple is undoubtedly top five. So not enabling or allowing that customer persona to have access to that simple product, which is buying Apple shares. These people are using those products, they're customers. Why shouldn't they be stakeholders in that financial reward? So really, the problem statement is how do we allow a, a broader spectrum society to create and preserve wealth?
Yes. Yeah. And I think that you raised like a great point. As you were speaking, I was like, yeah, actually, whichever brand it is, like Apple, Nike, like
Yeah.
whatever it may be, if you're a customer,
You should be able to be a shareholder, right?
yes, it should be included in the pricing. Like
Yeah.
thinking about reimagining like revenue models, it's well, yeah, if I buy a computer, then I also get like
Yeah.
fractional shares. just become.
Well, I think if you're living, I've lived in New York and London, I think that doesn't really maybe be front and center of your mind. Like I think and most people in London and New York can buy Nike or Apple shares, but that's not the case on a large number of markets. Certainly we operate. So if we can use technology, in our case, it's blockchain technology, Web3 infrastructure to enable that scenario, then that's essentially what we at Facet are on hyper focus.
Yes. And can you expand then on who are your customers? Because you just made a distinction right now, the UK, US type of customer versus your customers.
Yeah, so our customers, I gave you the example of our developers that are incredibly young, tech savvy, smart in emerging markets, making money because they're serving customers, sort of companies abroad with their technology expertise. These are individuals that are getting paid in, let's say, dollars even, but they don't have the ability to really create, to create and more importantly, preserve wealth for generations to come. So again, and it's interesting because in a lot of our markets, the demographic is such that most countries do have a large proportion of their population that is young, that is tech savvy, do have smartphones, but they don't have the ability to, let's say, create and preserve wealth for themselves or for the generations, kids, etc. Right. So again, the large segment of society that perhaps is underserved, but has somewhat exposure to the global sort of opportunity set is probably our ideal customer person.
And why do you think, sorry, what could be their pain points? As in, why, if they are young professionals making money, they are still struggling to build wealth?
So that's a great question, actually. And it's one that we spend a lot of time thinking about. And the answers, surprised us. In many cases, it's just lack of knowledge. So a lot of what we do is really educating people about the importance of investing, how to invest early, diversification. And then obviously, so that's from broad sort of area of focus and perhaps low hanging fruit. But in a lot of our markets, there are very specific issues as well. Hyperinflation, I think you talked about earlier. That is a global phenomenon in terms of prices. Inflation globally is an issue. So those are some of the sort of real areas of focus for us is how do we serve those people that have the theoretical ability to perhaps create wealth but don't know how to or aren't given the opportunity to do.
Yeah. Can you expand on that? As in the how? What's your solution? How do you help them?
So very simplistically, offering people think of Facet, we are a regulated exchange. We have obviously licenses across our markets, which are essentially crypto licenses. But we offer a broader array of financial assets on blockchain infrastructure. And so enabling people in Bangladesh, for example, to buy US equities is something that we are squarely focused on and isn't necessarily something that certainly to our surprise has been solved for. And there are many markets across the world where that's the case. So allowing people across the world to have access to high quality financial assets to be able to create and preserve wealth. Those assets can take the form of US stocks, they can take the form of bonds, metals, commodities, in addition to obviously cryptocurrency.
Mhm.
But those are the opportunities that we're focused on. We want to be able to offer our customers across a market of almost 2 billion people in in Asia. Perfect. So definitely something that we're very excited about.
Yeah, and this is like a not naive, but like a basic question. But it's also it comes from the community, right? That it's like, hey, if you are giving access to people to invest using blockchain technology in the background, why does that make you an innovative fintech?
I think there's lots of questions around innovation versus invention. Really, at the end of the day, whether we're innovative or need to be inventive, we're trying to solve. We're squarely focused on solving a pain point for the customer.
Mhm.
We're as long as we're solving that using a piece of technology, a horizontal technology infrastructure like blockchain that has a genuine need in our markets, the customer that has a genuine problem and a solution that has a genuine need. That's all we're trying to do, really. It's not about trying to fit a square peg into a round hole and really force the adoption of a certain type of technology. It's that technology makes sense in the environmental context in which we're operating. And ultimately, if you're focused on solving customer problems and pain points, how you solve those is almost not relevant or as relevant. And so, we think that the way to do so is to use blockchain infrastructure, which is interoperable, which can be scaled across countries, which can allow the movement of capital across countries, which is incredibly difficult. And that's how we think. If you're focused on those areas for problem solving, then whether you're deemed to be innovative or inventive or not is almost secondary.
Yes, and I like that mindset a lot because we've seen it twice, multiple times in the past few years. That it's like when blockchain started getting like gaining popularity, it was like, oh, we'll use blockchain for this, blockchain for the other. Everybody was in the, oh, we'll use blockchain. But now with AI, it's the same. We cannot just go and build an AI product just because
Yeah,
it has to solve a need.
absolutely. And I think there's a tendency, especially for technologists, and I'll include myself in that bracket, is that we come across a piece of technology which is transformative at its core, super exciting, very interesting. And then you're essentially trying to find the problem to fit into that sort of back solve for that technology. And I think there's plenty of literature out there that sort of now tells you that that's probably not the right way to go. And so if you'd asked the question earlier, I think around what are we focused on? And that's why if we're focused on just solving a problem, whether we use AI to solve that problem or blockchain, it almost comes naturally. Because you'll come through a process of natural selection whereby you'll figure out that using AI, for example, to onboard customers within the fintech ecosystem is actually the right thing to do, as opposed to have lots of agents trying to verify identity documents. Um,
Exactly.
so really, that's a case of using AI where it just makes a lot of sense, which is, let's say, the onboarding using computer vision based AI for onboarding. That becomes fairly commonplace now. Before even AI was seen to be in its hype phase.
Exactly. Yeah. And then I think having said that, it's like technology does have a place in all of these. No, technology is important. So, what can you explain to us? What is Connect network?
Yeah, so the Fasset Connect network, Monica, really is just so when we think about how do we reach, we've talked about reaching 98% of society and wider subsegments of society. Really, we have to think creatively about distribution and how do we target the maximum amount of customers. And Fasset Connect essentially is our sort of B2C sort of distribution arm. What I mean by that is if you go into a lot of our markets, you have banks that are serving existing customers in some way, shape, or form, even if they don't have bank account, even if people don't have bank accounts, they may go into a bank account to pay a bill. So banks have regular touch points with customers. And then telcos, for example,
Yeah.
almost everybody has a phone nowadays. And we've deployed Fasset Connect as a B2B to C solution embedded in those telco apps. For example, in Indonesia, where we're partnered with Indosat, one of the largest telcos in the world with over 100 million customers, is for us to go and try and reach those 100 million customers is difficult. It requires a lot of capital and a lot of investment and a lot of time. If we can leverage existing distribution channels and essentially offer white label solutions or embedded solutions, there's a lot of talk about elite finance in fintech as well. So this is essentially Fasset Connect is a sort of smarter way to distribute our product offering to again a wider segment of society.
Interesting, because that I hadn't understood that. So basically, you have your consumer customers, business customers,
Yes.
and you also have an embedded finance solution.
Yeah. So essentially, it's almost like three business lines, right? So it's absolutely B2C, it's B2B, and then it's B2B2C.
Yes.
So absolutely. And again, the idea being we almost are agnostic as to how the customer accesses some of these assets. We just think that it's the right thing to do to offer a wide array of financial assets to a wide array of society. So I don't think it's only in maybe self-serving for us to try and just target this massive problem directly on our own by trying to go to market on our own. That if we can leverage existing ecosystems, then why not? Because ultimately, this is the right thing to do for people, farmers, sort of young people, workers, students. Everybody should have the opportunity at any price point. They should have the opportunity to really create and preserve wealth.
Yes. And I think that leads us to my next question that I had, that it's your customer promise. It's very exciting. You have a customer promise that it makes you go, ooh, I want that. I want that product. Whenever they are selling, I want that. And the promise is basically start earning like a pro investor with a suite of financial tools to maximize returns on your way to financial freedom. That is a big promise.
Yeah, and I think and obviously this is maybe a sort of power of marketing, right? All of us inherently, intrinsically crave freedom. And certainly financial freedom, right? Not being able to have that is difficult. And even in developed markets, by the way, it's not just in emerging markets. You've got some of the same problems we talked about in terms of cost of living in the developed markets as well. And so I think it's a value prop that appeals to everybody, but it's also something that we are deeply driven by, which is that if you follow certain principles, certain investing principles, for example, certain money management principles, then actually over a period of time, this doesn't happen overnight. So there's no sort of silver bullet here. We're not saying going by sort of meme coins that give you 100x. Like that is not our value proposition at all. We're saying, look, there are no shortcuts, but if you, with the right tools over a period of time, financial freedom, financial inclusion, financial accessibility should be should be achievable for every. Now, some people may get there earlier. Some people may have some tools that allow them to get there earlier. Some people may just be lucky. But you can follow systematic processes to really achieve that blue sky over a period of time.
Yes. And you offer multiple products as well. Like it's not just like investments. It seems like you have like a solid business proposition as well. So your business proposition is basically turn digital and real world spendable utility tokens. Can you explain to us what does that mean?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. I'll try and make it a little bit more digestible perhaps, but it's essentially, I talked about buying Apple shares, let's say Google shares, right? And the reality is that in some countries, in most countries actually, even buying one Apple share is very difficult. North of $300, let's say most people, that's half of their monthly income, let's say. So the ability to, this is where we talk a lot about tokenization, where when if you can tokenize real world assets, you can fractionalize access and asset prices, then you essentially achieve that target, that goal of financial inclusion, affordability, access. And so if you can tokenize stocks, then offer sort of exposure to economic upside via tokens even, then ultimately you're solving a real problem. I keep on coming back to this is if you're solving a real problem, it's almost, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but you can be agnostic as to how do you solve that problem. And there's
Mhm.
different ways of solving a problem. In our case, we use blockchain as a horizontal technology way. But you could use elements of AI and you could use conventional Web 2.0. So that's just our take on this.
Yes, and talking about more about technology, I want to switch gears more towards product as such. So, how, how did you build a winning strategy, product strategy?
So we have obviously a bit of magic sauce, which I'll sparingly shed some light on. We have internally, we have a very well-defined, complex product framework, and I can give you the acronym. It's because I don't think it will mean a lot to a lot of people. It's CMS, BC, Triple O, BFS. Like it's a mouthful of an acronym that essentially drives our product strategy, and we spend at the end of the year an enormous amount of time flushing that out. And what it basically means is what assets are we going to bring? How do we bring those assets onto our platform and make those assets very accessible? How can you move money in and out of digital assets in a very seamless and easy way? And then how can you, once you have access to those assets, how can you create wealth? Because there are things like staking, there are things that you can do with, for example, you may have gold, you can lend that gold out and earn a return. And so the first sort of, I think this uh, triple axis almost. One axis that drives our product strategy is what are the types of assets that we put on our platform, that we list on our platform. The second axis is how do we make those assets accessible, seamless,
Mhm.
broad spectrum of society. And then the third axis is once you have those assets, what can you do with those assets to generate an incremental return? So that's our very, sort of basic, sort of in a nutshell, that's our kind of product framework or construct. And at the end of 2023, we created 200-page document to really flush this out across all of our markets because it's very complex. If you just think about the numerous ways to pay for an asset or for a good, there's probably a dozen ways that you can buy a pair of sneakers. Yeah. It's the same thing with buying a stock. There are a dozen ways to move money in and out of, of an ecosystem or a platform. It's fairly complex. And when you look at that across many markets, it becomes even more complex.
So, you documented those ways of, let's say, how did you move money and then multiply times markets?
Yes. Yeah. So it's literally, we have a matrix by market, and that matrix includes the number of ways that you could buy an asset for example.
Yeah.
So literally, it's like it reminds me a little bit of when you're studying high school chemistry and you've got the periodic table. It literally is x-axis, y-axis, and then, yeah, in some instances, 20, 30 different ways to achieve a given outcome.
Interesting. I love that because it's beyond a product methodology, let's say. It is like the product process
Yeah.
and the thinking framework applied specific to your business. That's on paper, not in your head, but on paper.
Yeah. Sometimes it's the power of kind of visualization, right? So when you've got 12 product folks in a room, having things in a visual form really helps flush out concepts, do things better. Age old kind of whiteboarding is how things have always been done. But yeah, having things very clearly articulated, especially complex sort of matters, can really help simplify execution in the future.
Yes.
A lot of this is very intuitive as well. It's not uh, sort of book product management 101. It just requires a little bit of deep thinking. And when you combine smart people together in a room and think about a problem and then find solutions, you'll come up with many ways to solve a problem.
Yes. I like that approach. Like not only writing the process, but almost like the ingredients,
Yeah.
the ingredients to the solution.
Yeah. Everybody likes a pot roast. What goes into sort of marinating and cooking and is equally important and eventually gives you the outcomes that you need. We think about now, I'll come back to fintech, and there are different ways to onboard customers. You might come up with a more sort of intricate or complex approach and ultimately simplify that over time. Even that requires challenging and thinking critically about processes.
Yeah.
So really it's onboarding is just one element of, let's say, fintech's uh, value proposition.
Exactly. And you touched on a key word that is execution. Execution can be hard in
Oh,
terms of, especially if you have like deadlines.
yeah, I can't remember who said this, right? But it's ideas are ideas that when the rubber meets the road is when things get real. And you got to have the right combination of kind of idea generation and execution. But execution is incredibly difficult in
Yeah.
in a very complex set of circumstances and environments, multi-currency, multi-country, multi-jurisdiction, regulatory oversight, multi-regulatory oversight. So it's incredibly complex, which is why you've got to try and simplify the complexity. And how you do that can vary, but in our case, it's really about having a very clearly articulated, thoughtful product design frame.
Excellent. So it's not about, in your case, it's not the, it seems like the answer to good execution is good design framework,
Design framework.
product design.
Yeah, absolutely. I always think of frameworks as perhaps necessary but not sufficient conditions for success. You have to have some framework, even if it's in your head, to be able to think logically. But just having that framework alone doesn't guarantee success or a given outcome, which is where, as you said, execution comes into play. Really, idea generation, where you then use frameworks coupled with high performance execution, should hopefully lead to ideal outcomes.
Yes. And then it's like the triad, right? It's like product strategy, execution, and then to get those outcomes, not because we built it and we built it great and on time, but we're going to have customers. So the next one is go and get some customers and grow the business and basically do product growth. How do you approach product growth then?
Yeah, it's tricky, especially in our case where we've got B2C, B2B, and B2B2C. So you've got to have different strategies for different verticals, different go-to-market strategies across different countries, different value propositions that you really. I was having this conversation with somebody earlier where I said, look, we talk a lot about whether we want to have a global product or have a localized product because there are pros and cons to both. And eventually we may want to have some sort of a hybrid. We call it a global product, which has certain global sort of features, but then is obviously nuanced by country, geography, jurisdiction. So you've got the complexity of different countries, and then you've got different go-to-market strategies. But I think the common thread, the nexus, is that if you're solving a critical problem for your customer, it just makes life much easier. On the B2B side, there's been a lot of institutional adoption of crypto and blockchain. Now, that's not something that it's very difficult to actively market to a sophisticated enterprise and get them to buy a given value proposition. But if they arrive at that conclusion themselves, because the industry is suddenly starting to understand that this piece of technology is actually quite powerful, then it makes essentially your sales pitch or your product growth a lot easier. So it's interesting. There are B2B, longer sales cycles, sophisticated sort of sales approaches versus, let's say, B2C, which maybe using conventional performance marketing tools, you can target. And then B2B2C is a combination of both, let's say.
Exactly. Yes, because you're right. It's like sales is different and the
Yeah.
three of them B2B, B2C,
Yeah.
like B2B2C. Yes.
Yeah. And we have different people that do. So we've got obviously our enterprise team is from a sales perspective split out. You have pre-sales consultants and engineers that are involved in the actual selling of that product versus, let's say, a B2C or app, which is driven more by, let's say, conventional performance marketing.
Yes. And then on that, let's say on the B2C one, do you run performance marketing just with traditional digital performance marketing, or are you using the whole product growth cycle that you have, like your hypothesis and you experiment and you try to learn and you optimize and all that stuff?
Yeah. The honest answer, Monica, is which you're constantly solving for it, right? So there's never a silver bullet. So running digital campaigns is necessary, but it doesn't always get you for the desired outcomes, right? So we use, I guess, on that, we'll use a combination of kind of growth hacking and tactical activation type strategies in addition to, let's say, digital channels, which I think only have real efficacy after a period of time when you establish the brand. But at the same time, we're trying to build the brand and people subconsciously only, you only get their trust when they've seen that brand again and again. So it may take a little bit longer for conventional performance marketing to really
Mhm.
have an impact. But you have to do it. We're in this for the long run. And we have to start somewhere, and that's building the brand and running those campaigns and running sort of performance marketing strategies, but then also doing some tactical things, which can be more near-term impact oriented.
Yes, because it's like you say, it's a long-term game. So building brand equity is equally important than just a campaign.
Especially when you're trying to get people to part with their money. And so if you're parking your money, and we say this to our audience, is that definitely make sure that you're parking your money with a licensed, regulated platform that is safe, that is secure, obviously easy to use, intuitive. But yeah, when you're trying to get people to park with their hard-earned cash, that sort of brand equity that takes on maybe even longer.
Ye-
So it's definitely a long-term game. But yeah, I think we're prepared to be in this for the long run. So happy with that.
Good. We cannot make all this a reality without people. So, how, as a leader, how do you bring the best out of your people?
Yeah. Again, I think I was listening to somebody the other day talk about one of the biggest challenges that a company faces across the board, whether it's Apple or a startup. And it definitely comes down to people and hiring the best people. And in the case of kind of venture and startups, Monica, it's even harder, right? Because you're trying to build from 0 to 1. That's where having a very, coming back to the first point, I think when we started this podcast, what really important is the mission, right? So if people really genuinely believe in the mission, and then that makes a little bit easier. You hire people with a certain conviction that they're doing the right thing, coupled with obviously a high performance culture. I think startups are not for everybody, and there's definitely a certain type of a person that gets drawn to a startup, especially at a 0 to 1 sort of phase. So really, we we spend a lot of time thinking about hiring and how do we hire the right people and with the right. And I come up actually talk a lot about having people with the right attitude. And that's very important. The right mindset. How do you test for that? It's very difficult because you only really get insights over a period of time into somebody's attitude or mindset. It's difficult. It's definitely difficult. Having referrals and using sort of network effects is helps to some extent, but that also has its limits when you're talking about scaling. When you start scaling, you really need to have very robust processes, policies, procedures within the HR. And I think that's why our people team is probably, in addition
Yes.
to engineering and products, is probably one of the most important functions within the company.
Agree. And then you used the word high performance culture at least twice. What do you mean with that?
Yeah, and I think I guess it won't come as a surprise. A lot of people refer to sports teams, right? So when you're part of a sports team, the weakest link can be a point of weakness for the whole team, right? So you can't have any one source of weakness. Everybody has to be pulling their weight. Everybody has to be performing at a certain level. There's got to be a roll up your sleeves, hands-on type of a mindset. And so in that way, in that respect, startups are very similar to sports teams. You can't have chinks in the armor because those become vulnerabilities for the entire operation. So I think our performance, and I've been very fortunate, even when I did work in sort of corporations, they were very high performance sort of cultures, even though they were much larger than where I am right now. But if you have the right sort of values, the mission, the right leadership, all of those things combined can actually generate the desired outcomes.
Yes. And we cannot have high performance without certain acceptance, well, especially on a startup, without being accepting of failure because we go fast, right?
Absolutely. Fail fast is what we say, right? So,
Yeah.
so absolutely, it requires. That's why it's startups aren't for everybody. It does require a certain attitude, aptitude, risk tolerance. So it's definitely not one for the faint-hearted. That's for sure. But that's why if your mission is really, if you're true to your values, if your mission is a strong one, compelling vision, backed by a compelling vision, even in those darkest of dark days, you still plow through. because I think about startups. So it's like roller coasters. The highs are really high and the lows are super low. But if you like riding roller coasters, then that becomes that can be that could be an acquired taste, but becomes very ingrained.
Yes, and that's refreshing to hear somehow, because I usually say, I don't know if people ask me like, "Hey, I don't know, like, how do you go through the tough times?" But I just say, sometimes you just have to hang on to the purpose, and then go that.
Or just plow through, right? So just keep going.
Yeah,
Um,
you just push through.
yeah. I think if you stop to reflect too much, sometimes you might get bogged down by the weight, the gravity of the situation or the thoughts. And so you've got to be very resilient. You've got to have a high threshold for risk and pain.
Yes.
But you've got to keep your eye on the prize, which comes back to your mission and what are you actually trying to do. And we're very fortunate. I'm very fortunate to be working at Fasset because I just think the mission is so grand, so compelling. Just so happens that it sort of intersects with my background in terms of living in sort of Asia and the developing world, but having the luxury and opportunity to also study and work in the West, and then marry that up with my personal background in, let's say, financial services, and then use technology because I see the power of digitization. So it's just like that perfect confluence of all of these things makes the journey very rewarding.
Definitely. I can totally relate to that. But exactly, at the end of the day, it's a journey, right? It's
Yeah.
part of the job, but it's a journey.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the destination is obviously the destination, but that could take a very long time. If you're enjoying the journey, then the day to day just becomes a lot easier.
Exactly. My very last question, and it's one of my favorite questions to ask everyone. If you were to change one thing in the industry, only one thing, that could have the most impact on customers, members of staff, and shareholders, what could that be?
We'll change wild things. I think, I guess I'll pin this back on what we're trying to do at Fasthead, which is being squarely fixated on solving a genuine problem statement. Again, if you're really focused on identifying and solving a real problem, I think a lot of what happens in the fintech community, in the broader technology space, is as technologists, we have a tendency to perhaps try and back solve for a given technology. There may be a hype, and everybody as human beings gets influenced or swayed by that hype. But if you're really trying to solve fundamental problems, and then technology happens to be an enabler, if everybody can just absolutely marry the real problem statement with the actual sort of underlying technology, I just think that we need to maybe come a little bit back to basics. Given that there's always a tendency for human beings to get carried away with technologies, but think big on customer and solving problems is in my view the best way to really scale things 10x, 100x.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Umair. It's been an amazing conversation.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much, Michael, for having me. Really, thank you so much.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you, everyone. See you next week. Ciao.